Thank you all so much for coming to tonight's event titled President Joe Biden's Inauguration, Post-Trump Rhetoric. My name is Phil Dalton, and I'm a professor in the Rhetoric and Public Advocacy program here at Hofstra, where I also run the political communication concentration. And in addition, I direct Hofstra's Center for Civic Engagement. My own research interests dovetail nicely with Hofstra's commitment to civic engagement, which is a big reason I'm so proud to be a part of it. I'm interested in public dialogue, not civility for civility's sake, but in understanding how to create a political system where people engage one another with more than just the hope that they can affect change. And that means we need room for civil and at times uncivil public communication. Yesterday, Joe Biden called on the citizens of the country to end this uncivil war. And this is a clear reference to the events preceding Inauguration Day. And not just the insurrection at the Capitol on January 6th, and not just the events of the past 4 years that saw the proliferation of social media, that allowed the proliferation of bombast and lies. In 1978, when the GOP had been out of the House of Representatives' control since 1933, Newt Gingrich, who later became House Speaker after the GOP took control in 1995, said in a campaign speech to young Republicans the following: "I think that one of the great problems we have in the Republican Party is that we don't encourage you to be nasty. We encourage you to be neat and obedient and loyal and faithful and all those Boy Scout words, which would be great around the campfire, but they're lousy in politics." And 10 years before Republicans took control of the House of Representatives, Republican strategist Grover Norquist created Americans for Tax Reform, a nonprofit tax reform advocacy group created at the request of Ronald Reagan. And in 2005, the Christian Science Monitor quoted Norquist saying, "We're trying to change the tones in the state capitals and turn them toward bitter nastiness and partisanship." Well, is mission accomplished? My point is that incivility in Washington, D.C. runs deeper than Donald Trump and Steve Bannon and QAnon. Why it exists can be saved for a different discussion. Today, we acknowledge that rhetoric, the words of our president, have the potential to counter these forces, just as they may have had the capacity to trigger them on the 6th. Yesterday's inauguration gives us the first glimpse of Joe Biden as a rhetorical president. And to discuss this new era, we have 4 distinguished guests with us to share their thoughts and observations. Our guests will speak in the order they're introduced, each for roughly 10 minutes, and following their observations, we invite you to ask questions. And in fact, write your questions in the chat along the way, and I'll find them and vet them and ask them when we get to the end. But now, please allow me to introduce our speakers. Our first speaker will be Ryan Fallert. Ryan is an undergraduate senior at Hofstra University, majoring in rhetoric and public advocacy with a concentration in political communication, and is also majoring in linguistics. Additionally, he works at Hofstra's Writing Center, and his main areas of interest include political speech writing and helping other students improve their writing abilities and confidence. And I added to this that he's also a member of the Lambda Pi Eta Honor Society. Our next speaker will be John Murphy. John Murphy studies the history of U.S. political rhetoric. He's the author of John F. Kennedy and the Liberal Persuasion, a critique of President Kennedy's greatest speeches and the liberal tradition. He analyzes the evolution of political languages and has written on John and Robert Kennedy, Richard Nixon, Bill Clinton, Martin Luther King Jr., George W. Bush, and Barack Obama. His scholarly work has appeared in journals such as Rhetoric and Public Affairs, Quarterly Journal of Speech, and American Literary History. His commentary on the presidency and presidential rhetoric regularly appears in popular media outlets such as The Conversation USA, Washington Post, New York Times, and USA Today. He's currently working on a book project concerning the civil rights rhetoric of James Baldwin, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Martin Luther King Jr. Following John Murphy will be Tomeka Robinson. Dr. Robinson is a professor of rhetoric and public advocacy and the director of forensics in the Department of Writing and Writing Studies and Rhetoric at Hofstra. Dr. Robinson is currently serving as the immediate past president of the Pi Kappa Delta National Forensics Honors Association. She's the first person of color to hold the position of president in any national collegiate speech and debate organization. She's currently involved in several research projects with colleagues across the globe on projects focused on global health risk and the impact of race on health. Additionally, she's been invited to give several lectures throughout the United States and Brazil, and regularly gives commentary to regional and national news organizations about issues of politics, health, and race. And we'll close with Dr. Worth. Dr. Worth is the director of the George R. Brown Forensic Society and lecturer in the School of Humanities at Rice University. He's been coaching intercollegiate speech and debate since 1993. He's taught a wide variety of students, including high school, community college, and university students, graduate students, and military personnel, both at home and abroad. His research interests are in pedagogy of forensics, critical cultural studies of communication, communication in space, philosophy of communication, and rhetorical theory. And now, to begin, I'd like to hand things off to Mr. Fallert. So Ryan, would you like to begin?
Sure. How's it going, everybody? Hope you're doing well. We live in unprecedented times. Been hearing that a lot lately, and frankly, it's hard to disagree, but I've heard it enough for it to lose meaning. So it means that we've never seen such times, such accents, such experiences, pandemic, insurrection, global warming at an accelerating rate, blatant mistreatment and disrespect of protesters fighting for equality. And despite all of that, despite an attack that happened only weeks earlier, despite National Guard surrounding the Capitol, despite walls being put up to protect the area, and despite that area being designated as a green zone, the 46th President of the United States was inaugurated. Despite these unprecedented times, we witnessed a very precedented moment. When President Obama was being inaugurated in 2009 after the 2008 election, I was 9 years old, and I remember staying home from elementary school to watch history. There were a lot of folks who spoke that I did not recognize, and I can't say I remember what they said all that clearly, but I remember watching President Obama speak and feeling excited and somehow proud of our democracy and felt patriotic for our country. At least some of that is due to the power of ritual. The strong language used generation after generation to affirm the position of President of the United States of America. The inaugural address is important to represent the change of power, typically a peaceful transfer, which confers the authority of the Republic to the President-elect. But beyond that ritual, the situation is incredibly important. We exist in an exigence right now. According to Lloyd Bitzer, any exigence is an imperfection marked by urgency. It's a defect, an obstacle, something waiting to be done, a thing which is other than it should be. And he continues and recognizes that there's a specific subset of exigences, which is a rhetorical exigence. An exigence is rhetorical when it's capable of positive modification, when positive modification requires discourse or can be assisted by discourse. It's a situation where language can be used wholly or partially to fix the imperfection. So in this situation, there were a lot of imperfections. I already listed COVID and the insurrection among many others. The thing I was most looking to see when President Biden would speak is to see if he would speak about the insurrection attempt. Most Americans were shocked and dismayed that some people would take it upon themselves to attack the Capitol building. So dismayed that a lot of us are still confused or shocked. Like, what do we do with that? How can we possibly understand that? Quarantine begins the unease. Insurrection complicates things further. So what do we do? People born in the United States have never had to respond to an insurrection. So what do we do? The feeling of anxiety or confusion or of not knowing what's going on while we watch the National Guard build a militarized zone around the Capitol building and we don't know what to do, that's the rhetorical exigence that I saw. So we have that, which is begging for Biden to talk about it. And we also have the typicalities of an inaugural address. According to research done by Carolyn Coors Campbell and Kathleen Hall Jameson, most speeches of this kind are going to do four things. They're going to unify the audience by reconstituting it as the people, rehearse shared values drawn from the past, enunciate the political principles that will guide the new administration, and demonstrate that the president appreciates the requirements and limitations of executive power. Step too far out of that mold and it'll distract people. Even if they can't verbalize what would be wrong about it, the genre of inaugural address has these checkboxes that need to be filled. So we have those two competing ideas for what Biden should have said. Should he have presented things as business as usual and just gone through the ritual? Or should he have responded to the growing threat against the sanctity of our union and against the lives of our elected officials? Briefly, Biden did both. He tried to fill both molds at the same time. He's been speaking about his belief in returning to bipartisanship and bipartisan rule and respect of one another for many months now, seeking inclusiveness and a relationship across the aisle. His speech persisted in those values, reconstituting the audience as the people very clearly, and that's the first checkbox. And then he also took time to recognize the insurrection, which certainly affects those values. It affects the nature of reconstituting the people as the people, because suddenly some of those people have acted in direct opposition to the Constitution. He recalled the past and restated ideals upon which our nation was founded, like truth and unity, but also took time to recognize our fundamental right to disagree with one another peacefully. He felt it necessary to once again respond to the crises in America while also answering the second part of the inaugural statement, expectations. He avoided speaking on many plans for domestic policy, but he did speak to foreign policy plans, such as joining alliances that President Trump specifically removed the United States from and rejoining the world once more. And then for the fourth point, Biden also began his speech by recognizing that his victory is a victory of democracy rather than a victory of a candidate. He is representative of the people who voted for him rather than claiming the power for himself. And in so doing, he recognizes his role as the president. So Biden did Biden. The video he used to announce his candidacy, which feels like 27 years ago at this point, was mostly speaking about the white supremacist rally that happened in August 2017 in Charlottesville. He pointedly disavowed their actions and began championing his message of peace and bipartisanship to stop such a thing from ever happening again. 3 years later, we see another violent assault on democracy, and Biden so then again now condemned the attack and performed his ritualistic duties as the 46th president of the United States, a return to normalcy, a return to presidentiality. So despite all of that theory and thinking, most importantly, did it feel patriotic? Did it inspire a sense of hope? It's unscientific, I'll give you that. But if he did everything right and I didn't feel it, then it's certainly less than successful. I've been watching a lot more news and C-SPAN now than when I was 9, let me tell you that. And I also find a certain cynicism in myself that wasn't there 12 years ago, but it felt to me like he seized the moment and gave us a direction to go as a nation. I feel more confident now in our nation's choice of president and feel more sure of our nation's path forward. And that's really all I could ask from an address like this. When I look back on that 9-year-old, I think he'd be excited either way, frankly, and I can only hope that that's a good omen for things to come. Thanks.
Thank you, Ryan. That was fantastic. I want to ask the audience, if you have questions, please type them in the chat. None have come up yet. Maybe you don't have any yet, but if they emerge, just write them there. I'll take note and and I'll ask them later on. But thank you again, Ryan. Let's now hear from Dr. Murphy. John?
Thank you, Philip, and thank you to Marianne Trasciatti for asking me to do this, and to all of you for showing up on a Thursday night right at the start of the semester to talk about a presidential inaugural. I appreciate the institutional perspective that Ryan took. As a scholar, I tend to be interested in genre and institution, that is, in types of speeches, and then how those types of speeches help to create, constitute, and support the institutions of which they are a part. And so when I think about the presidency, I tend to think about it from the perspective of Carlin Kors Campbell and Kathleen Hall Jamieson, whom Ryan cited. That is, as thinking about these kinds of genres or types of speeches that work to create a presidency. And so, what do inaugural addresses do? I want to suggest to you tonight that inaugural addresses answer the question, how does one become the president? Naturally, we know people get elected, and at least sometimes the vote is counted and certified in the halls of Congress. But in general, the president is a performative office. That is, it's not just about who gets the most votes, it's about the person who acts out the office, who is able to perform it. And we expect our presidents to be able to make arguments, to stand up in public, to represent the nation. And so inaugurals then are an answer to the question, how do you become president? Many religions require an ordination sermon. that when you become ordained as a minister, you're asked to give a sermon so that the audience can see, the congregation can see that you can speak the word of God. Similarly, when you become president and take the oath of office, you do so in front of the American people, a crowd of witnesses, and you are authorized to act as president through a speech in which you represent the nation, in which you show that you can articulate the fundamental values of the nation. In that sense, then, inaugurals are a ritual of renewal. They invest the president with the office. You take on, much like a pope gets special robes and a cool hat, so too does a president get Air Force One and his Secret Service protection. He takes on the clothing, as it were, of the office. That happens in the speech. It happens throughout lots of the parts of the ceremony. Now, to fulfill these demands, presidents generally do what Ryan indicated, those 4 kinds of requirements that Carlin and Kathleen talked about, that you unify the people, you talk about traditional values, you enunciate your political principles, you indicate your leadership. But what's fascinating about those is that those reflect a conflict at the heart of the presidency. Because the American Constitution creates an office that has functions that most other nations separate. Our president is both the head of state, the ceremonial head of the nation, akin to the Queen of England, but the president is also the legislative leader, akin to the Prime Minister of Great Britain. We expect our president both to represent us symbolically and politically. And if you think about those 4 areas that Ryan laid out there, the first 2 are really about the head of state function. They're values. They are our political principles. They are unity. They are the things that we stand for as one nation. But the second 2 are significantly controversial. They are political programs. They are choices. We make arguments. We assert leadership. To assert leadership, you generally have to say other people have done badly. So presidents always face a conundrum, a paradox in inaugural addresses. How do I unify the audience while at the same time articulating my political agenda? Be too political, I threaten unity. Too much unity, I wash out my political agenda. How do they solve this problem? Happily, we had some very serious public speakers who helped to found this nation. The Puritans, a group of religious dissenters who settled in Massachusetts at the start of the nation, believed themselves chosen of God. They saw themselves as establishing a religious commonwealth that would be, as John Winthrop famously put it, a city upon a hill for all of the world to see. Yet, of course, they were sinners. They were human. So if you believe yourself chosen from God, and yet you sin, what do? You engage periodically in rituals of renewal. You assert that you hold these great values, but oh no, I have declined, I have sinned, I have done terrible things. So I must adhere ever more strongly to those values in order to save myself and save my community, for my community to again be chosen of God. Presidents have generally adapted this to a variety of discourse, as have other political leaders. And I want to suggest to you today that you really see this underlying Joe Biden's inaugural address. All presidents use this form of civil religion at one time or another, most famously Abraham Lincoln's second inaugural address, which is basically a prayer more than it is a speech as he seeks to bind up the wounds of war. Biden yesterday felt that we too, as Ryan pointed out, had suffered extraordinary wounds over the past 4 years. And so you saw him at various parts of the speech extolling American values. In the opening, he proclaimed our democracy. He talked about the obstacles we have overcome in our history in World War II and elsewhere. And perhaps most interestingly, he visually reminded the audience by saying repeatedly, "Here we stand," where women marched in 1917. "Here we stand," where King spoke in 1963. "Here we stand," showing the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Monument. This is our covenant. These are the American values we treasure. But, he notes, we have declined. We have engaged in a culture of lies, not of truth. We've engaged in white supremacy, and he's the first president, to my knowledge, to call out white supremacy in an inaugural address. We have failed our covenant. We have engaged in white supremacy and systemic racism for 200 years and racial injustice. And so he argues we need to redeem ourselves. And that's when you get to the portion of the address where he talks about how we must listen to one another and restore our souls, how we must gain unity together. The end of the speech is particularly powerful for this. He has that pretty banal and terrible quotation from American Anthem. But once he gets past that, you've got a pretty nice ending where he talks about writing an American story of hope, not fear, of unity, not division, of light, not darkness. An American story of decency and dignity, of love and of healing, of greatness and of goodness. Those are nice parallel lines. Those are the redemptive qualities that we need as we go forward. So my argument would be that Biden's speech works, at least partly because he adapts the norms of Puritan civic renewal rhetoric to the demands of an inaugural address. He uses our American values to argue that we need to redeem ourselves and adhere more closely to them. One final point. The tricky thing about that, and what I really love about this kind of renewal rhetoric, it is the classic way to pass a progressive or liberal program in conservative clothing. That is, what Biden is doing is arguing that our sustaining American values are, in fact, the values of his political program, which does, in fact, include racial justice, a giant stimulus program, healthcare for all of those kinds of things. He's not naming all of those political principles here, but he is arguing that American values demand them. And in that way, I think this speech continues what Barack Obama did at Selma on Bloody Sunday in 2013. God, I'm having trouble with my math here. 2015, at the anniversary of Selma when he spoke, and told an alternative American story. And so that's what I think Biden is kind of doing here. Certainly Fox News recognized that he was calling them out. Tucker Carlson lost his head last night, arguing that Biden was calling them all white supremacists and he was going to arrest them all. So we sort of know where that's going to go. But they, to their credit, they clearly recognized he's trying to make his platform common sense, that his platform is all American. And that, I think, is the move this speech makes. Thank you.
Thank you very much, John. That was fantastic. The questions are coming in as a good discussion going on, but we're going to go to Dr. Robinson now and see what she has to add to the discussion. Dr. Robinson.
Thank you, and thank you all for being here. So before I get into my statements about the actual inaugural address, I would be remiss if I didn't talk about the historic moment of not just President Biden being the oldest president in the first term being inaugurated for the first term, but also of Vice President Kamala Harris. She is the first woman, full stop. Secondly, she is the first Black woman. Thirdly, she is the first South Asian woman, and all of those things are huge. She's also the first HBCU grad that is in office. And there's all of these historic moments of that, to which I think all of those played in very well into the conversation, even the tenor of the inaugural address. So first of all, President Biden delivered an inaugural address that used the word democracy more times than any other inauguration speech. And this was according to analysis by the American Presidency Project. And I think that this is significant because as we talk about, the moments that have happened within our country, not just 2 weeks ago, but have happened historically, talking about democracy and the principles of democracy is extremely important. Secondly, I really liked how President Biden laid out his priorities. They included addressing COVID-19, racial justice, climate change, and domestic extremism, including white supremacy. And as Dr. Murphy just said, he is the first president to actually use the language white supremacy. And that's rhetorically important because in order to actually deal with an issue, you have to actually be able to name it. There's power in actually naming what is there. And his actual statement, the actual quotation is, "A cry for racial justice, some 400 years in the making, moves us. The dream of justice for all will be deferred no longer. The cry for survival comes from the planet itself, a cry that can't be more desperate or any more clear. And now a rise of political extremism, white supremacy, domestic terrorism that we must confront and we will defeat." Our history has been a constant struggle between the American ideal that we're all created equal and the harsh, ugly reality that racism, nativism, fear, demonization have long torn us apart. The battle is perennial and victory is never assured. And I think that all of these choices are, like I said, quite significant because he's naming the evil that we must deal with and confronting it head on and saying, here is what it is. We have to deal with it. Yes, we've had this ideal that we're all created equal. It was written into our Constitution, but we know that even when it was written in the Constitution, that did not apply to all people. So we have to really think about how that's rhetorically significant to hear those words on the very first day of, here's what we're going to do. We're actually going to deal with it. And let's now talk about the equal application of justice for everybody. The second thing that I think was significant within his speech was that he made reference to the fact that truth is going to matter again. And we know that we are, with President Trump, we had a lot of things about, alternative truth and alternative facts. And he talked about, what do we need to do in order to address these truths? And it's really listening to the scientists, listening to what's actually there. There was also lots of references to collective responsibility, which was heavily framed in George W. Bush's inaugural addresses, but really wasn't talked about at all by President Trump, to where we all have a collective responsibility to deal with these things. It's not just the federal government and the office of the presidency that has to deal with these and our elected officials, but every single one of us has to work together in order to address these big issues. And these big issues, again, COVID-19, racial justice, climate change, domestic extremism, all of these things requires work from everyday people. The third thing was that he talked about unity, but it wasn't this idealized version of unity of us all just joining hands and just automatically coming back together, but rather unity with some accountability. He stated, "We'll press forward with speed and urgency, for we have much to do in this winter of peril and significant possibilities. Much to repair, much to restore, much to heal, much to build, and much to gain. And to overcome these challenges, to restore the soul and secure the future of America requires so much more than words. It requires the most elusive of all things in a democracy, unity, unity." And he ended with him being president for all Americans, all Americans. And I promise you, I will fight as hard for those who did not support me as for those who did. And again, this speaks to that collective responsibility and saying, like, yes, it's going to take us all working together, but we can achieve those ideals that we have laid out and we extol as being like foundational to our country. We can actually do it if we all take our responsibility. The last thing that I'm going to address is, I think, the most powerful moment of Joe Biden's inaugural address was when he took the moment of silence, when he actually didn't say a word, but rather allowed us to sit in that moment to acknowledge all of those that we have lost in the last however many years, but specifically looking at COVID-19 and all of those people who have lost, and we've lost needlessly. So I think that there's a lot of things that we can look at as far as the tenor, we can look at the words, but I think that very significantly, we have to address how it's all of our responsibility to be not just unified of just like pretending and everything is okay, putting a Band-Aid on a gaping wound, but to actually do some real healing.
Thank you, Dr. Robinson, for offering that. We continue to get great questions. I want to add, there are questions coming up about Donald Trump, and we might have a discussion about Trump's rhetoric another time. We could probably offer a course in it, but let's stick to Joe Biden's speech here, because there's a lot here to work with, and there's a lot of interest that is being said. And anyway, thank you very much, Tomeka, and let's now move on to Dr. Worth. David.
Okay. Thank you, Phil. Thanks for asking me to do this. I'm honored. Thanks, everyone, for coming. Thanks to Hofstra for hosting this event. This speech does so much. There's so many threads running through it. As our speakers up to this point have shown us, you can start in so many places. There are so many layers to this. I don't know who the speechwriter was. I actually haven't looked it up yet, but whoever they were, they did a really fine job. My initial reading of the speech is similar to some of the threads that we've discussed so far, maybe is slightly restricted. I want to focus on Biden's appeals to space as part of the American democracy narrative. In particular, the blending of space, unity, his appeal to unity and the sacred. He connects space, the space where the speech occurs, the Capitol, to the larger conceptual space of the nation, and connects the healing power of unity to that space. In the speech, he describes a scene of a democratic space that has been just saved from disaster, but is in serious need of repair. Biden interweaves this with the idea of ground that can be hallowed, has been hallowed, in fact, has been violated, and is in need of some kind of reconsecration. This scene is set up in a number of places in the speech. I'm going to reference a few of them. Some are sort of in order of the speech. Some I'm going to skip around a little bit. My interest in this kind of reading is how does he envision both the space that he's speaking in, the space in which democracy, American democracy, is occurring, and what that space might look like after his appeal, as well as after whatever else we might need to do. So he sets the scene. There's in the setting of the scene, there's a serious feeling of peril. Ryan does a great job of identifying specific kind of exigences, and Bitzer is certainly very appropriate here. Biden connects the fragility of democracy with the violation of sacred space, saying that democracy is fragile on this hallowed ground where just days ago violence sought to shake this capital's very foundation. We come together as one nation, under God, indivisible, to carry out the peaceful transfer of power as we have for more than 2 centuries. The idea that the land is broken sets the scene and is the backdrop for the speech in general. He returns to it even after appealing to unity later in the speech. And in that way, we can see that this idea of a broken land, a broken American democratic space pervades the speech. At the end of the speech, he refers to the potential for the future to judge us as having, quote, healed a broken land. So what's at stake for Biden is the health, maybe even the survival of democracy because of the violation of the space and the values that are indistinguishable from it. And I think a couple of our previous speakers have talked about that blending of values and space as well. But in the early section, he sets the scene in broad terms, listing challenges. A virus, lives, jobs, businesses closed, a cry for racial justice, a cry for survival from the planet itself, a rise in political extremism, white supremacy, and domestic terrorism that we must confront and defeat. These are all part of the conceptual space for him. They are all part of the sort of rhetorical situation, to use Bitzer's language, the setting in general, the scene in general. To repair the space, he appeals to the narrative that the group will write together and uses language that communicates this. His speech posits the group writ large as having the power to repair this brokenness, appealing to the people for unity. Importantly, and Phil, I know you just said we wouldn't talk about Trump's rhetoric, but importantly, this shifts the actor to the group, where Trump made the actor himself so many times, or made the actors a set of divided groups or a set of kind of divided people. And this shift, as our title, of this talk indicates, the post-Trump rhetoric, I'm guessing will be in evidence pretty obviously. If you watched the after party, the sort of Zoom music show after this, if any of you watched that, you saw that was an extremely strong theme, right? So this shifting of, as one of our earlier speakers referred to it, responsibility is pretty important. Biden differentiates between better angels and presumably worse ones, between better versions of us in this space and worse ones. He weaves in narrative elements that appeal to this positive version of the American story, which interestingly, he is recounting to us just days after his own administration's 1776 report, which cast its own interesting history of the American story. Biden says, narratives require heroes, or at least, or he doesn't say this, sorry, I say this. Narratives require heroes or at least hallowed figures. Biden thanks his predecessors, including Jimmy Carter, who's not physically there, but in thanking him, Biden brings him into the space conceptually. This is an important element. He calls the preceding presidents patriots, perhaps to reclaim this term. And he says, I've just taken the sacred oath that each of these patriots took, an oath first sworn by George Washington. Then, as we all, I'm sure, noticed, it jumps right out. He appeals to Lincoln in particular, an obvious application here, but he connects spatially and temporally to Lincoln as well, saying, in another January in Washington, on a New Year's Day in 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, where he put pen to paper. The president said, if my name ever goes down into history, it will be for this act, and my whole soul is in it. And then Biden makes the rhetorically significant move of directly connecting himself to those words as well by using the line, my whole soul is in it as well. So we see that he is blending or collapsing this story, the space, and the idea of its grand justifying story all into one place. In setting the context, he calls back to the physical and conceptual spiritual space, as Lincoln did in the Gettysburg Address. Biden says, so now on this hallowed ground, where just days ago violence sought to shake this capital's very foundation, we come together as one nation under God, indivisible, to carry out the peaceful transfer of power as we have in 1 2 centuries. This even shares the language of to hallow, though Lincoln said we cannot concentrate, we cannot hallow this ground. In talking about the battlefield and the sacrifices who died where he gave that speech, Lincoln says at that moment they cannot hallow it because it was the bloodshed on that battlefield that did it, not the rhetoric of the moment. Biden's use assumes that the transfer of power that has normally occurred where he's speaking has in fact hallowed it, and that only by continuing that transfer through maintenance of democracy, through unity, his solution, can it continue to be hallowed, moving the burden to the living to rhetorically hallow it through communicating unity. Most Western narrative elements contain polarities or binaries in some fashion. In addition to the setting outlined above, he also defines oppositionals that have violated the hallowed space or contribute to this overall kind of setting. He names anger, resentment, hatred, extremism, lawlessness, violence, disease, joblessness, hopelessness. Earlier, he notes that the most elusive thing in a democracy is unity. And unity is the thing that he appeals to in order to fix this broken land, to reconsecrate the violated ground. With unity, he says we can do great things, important things. And he says unity can overcome the kind of oppositionals that he lists earlier. For without unity, he says there's no peace, only bitterness and fury, no progress, only exhausting outrage, no nation, only a state of chaos. Finally, he arrives at reconsecration of space and a kind of rebirth. And so today, at this time, in this place, he says, let us start afresh. Here he returns explicitly to the space. He mentions the Capitol dome was completed amid the Civil War, that in this space, protesters had tried to block women voting, that MLK had spoken here, and that it was that day that Harris's swearing in had transformed that space as well. He then brings back in the idea of bloodshed and ultimate sacrifice by connecting the space to Arlington National Cemetery, where those who sacrificed lay. He connects to Lincoln yet again, this time invoking sacrifice of life as constituting this space as sacred. There's so much more I could say on this theme, but this was one interesting thread that I thought might contribute to our discussion. Interestingly, in a past era, there might have been some pretty heavy settler colonial narratives in here. Times have changed. There might have been a whisper in it of it, just a whisper of it though, when he says, we look ahead in our uniquely American way, restless, bold, and optimistic, and set our sights on the nation we know we can be and we must be. So that's a spatial metaphor that's kind of interesting in there. Overall, Biden presents a narrative of a broken land that's found itself broken through division. He calls for unity. His call for unity is not merely a call for conciliatory political communication. It's a call to reconstitute the space of democracy through unity. The space is represented by and conceptually indistinguishable from the democracy itself and the story of American democracy. Thus, damage to one is damage to the other. Repair to one is repair of the other.
Thank you, David, very much. There's a lot here, and there are a lot of questions that have come up. One came up that made me think of a question of my own, but I'll give voice to it. Someone asked, how do you draw back the disunity that has 85% of Republicans believing the race wasn't fairly won? And my question is, I think along those lines, which is, from what I saw in the speech, Joe Biden does not give voice to the opposition's point of view. He kind of reforms it as though I'm sure there are plenty of folks over there, he doesn't say these things, but it's my read on it, how he addresses the opposition. There are folks who may disagree with me, and then there are also extremists, but no need to lend any of today's time to give voice to those extreme positions, certainly. So he's kind of reframing the debate as though there's not much room for it. We are overwhelmed by the kinds of issues that you all mentioned, that he mentioned, the planet, racial injustice, and so on. What are your thoughts about that? I mean, in the past, like when Obama becomes president, he talks about reaching across the aisle and achieving bipartisanship. This is different than that. It's not one of negotiating some of what you want for what we want and hoping to split the difference. This is achieving something greater, symbolic unity, as you point out, David. Can that be done? And does his rhetoric, you think, get us closer to that? Any of you?
I'll take a stab at it. So first, I think that that's a tough question, because I think that you raise a great point in saying that there really isn't reaching across when people wanted to hang Vice President Pence. Like reaching across to those extremists, I don't think it's ever going to happen. Neither should it happen. But thinking about, what are some of the values of the conservative, true conservatives, not what has become the Trump party, which is not what the GOP is, but really thinking about, that fiscal conservatism and thinking about ways in which we can talk about, budgets and those things, I think goes a long way of getting more reach across the aisle and better packaging that can appeal to GOP. But trying to appeal to absurdists, I think it's just a waste of time. And I honestly think that it would serve the GOP, honestly, to separate themselves from the extremists, allow them to form their own party. President Trump is talking about forming the Patriot Party. Let them save your party and save the ideals of what true American conservatism is and separate that from what it's become as far as the party of Trump.
Thank you. Yeah, Ryan.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think that there's certainly an aspect of his speech where he did speak to those that disagree with him rather than those that want to kill him, right? He disavows the white supremacists that marched on the Capitol to capture and kidnap Nancy Pelosi and others so that they could be out of the way, right? Those are crazy people. And President Biden told them that they were crazy and said, I'm not going to work with you. He did say very, very pointedly at multiple different points, you can disagree with me as long as it's peaceful, and then I'll respect you for doing so, because that's what democracy in the American tradition is based on. It's based on debate. It's based on understanding that you don't have to agree with someone to be able to move forward, because in a democracy, you're not going to have 100% of the people working on the same wavelength. You have to have disagreement in there, and it's a fundamental right of democracy, like he said. So in that sense, yeah, I think that he's happy to work within a bipartisan lens as long as those people disagree with him, so long as they don't want to go so far as to kill him. And I think that that's probably a good line to draw.
Well, let me respond to that, if I may. I'm not saying he should have, made an argument with racists. What I'm saying is there are people I know who are Republicans who would agree with the conclusion that the government is broken. And they would hear yesterday's speech as, all right, here's the solution. Let's have a lot more of it. And he doesn't entertain that at all. He's saying, here are problems and here are solutions. There's no space for that. And is that an interesting observation at all? Or I think I felt that it was as I listened to the speech, because he's kind of taking over the stage and redefining the issues.
I'd have two thoughts about that. The first one is, I think the response to those who say the government is broken and all he's proposing is more government is to have good government, is to actually do things for people. I tend to be a supporter of President Obama, but one of his great failures was a good deal of his stuff was either the great things he did were like tax breaks, and they were cloaked and nobody could quite tell what the government was doing for them. And by every account, Biden learned from that experience. And they're determined to send checks directly to people. They are going to cancel chunks of student loans. They're going to show government in action doing things to make your specific life better. They're going to build bridges in your area so that you have a brand new bridge to drive over to go to work. I mean, so I think that's one response he will make, is to show that government does have the power to make your world work better. The second difficulty, the giant elephant in the room, is what I mentioned earlier, which is Fox News, which is an absolutely pernicious influence in American life. And after Joe Biden gave a speech that, as Tomeka said, mentioned democracy more than any other speech in history, and mentioned unity at least 11 times, the only takeaway they had last night was he called us all white supremacists. And all he's going to do is attack us. And so for 3 hours, that was the company line. And if you were part of that 85% of Republicans that somebody mentioned in the chat, that's probably what you were watching last night. And so your impression of the inaugural is Biden spent 20 minutes attacking all Republicans as white supremacists. And that's one of the, if not the major difficulty in effective political rhetoric today, I think, is the pernicious influence of Fox News. And I don't know what we do about that, honestly. I mean, right now they're in a race to the bottom with OAN and with Newsmax. I mean, they're all sort of competing for slivers of the audience. And so I'm not quite sure how that's going to work out. But the hope has to be that people see their lives getting better and they just stop paying attention.
Thank you. Another question that came to mind in a discussion I was having with Dr. Trasciatti just the other day was about religion in this speech. And the question came to my mind as she was, and she can speak for herself, but you were very happy that he made mention of St. Augustine. And I wondered if the speech wasn't too religious. and please disabuse me of that. But Jimmy Carter has been accused in the past of giving kind of the green light to bringing religion and faith into government, and then the Republican Party we see today kind of ran with that. And does this continue that green light, if you buy my thesis, or is this just the context we're in now and he's adapted to it?
I don't want to monopolize, but I'll jump in there because I've done a lot of work on politics and political and religious rhetoric. Presidential use of religious metaphors and rhetoric goes back to the founding of the country. Most famous in Lincoln's second inaugural, but every president generally cites God in his inaugural. And in fact, I don't think there is an inaugural address that doesn't have God threading through it. Usually it's a way to demonstrate that they, especially in recent years, that they aren't going to blow up the world. So if God is our judge, I can't really destroy his whole creation by you sending off the nukes. So trust me, I'm okay. But generally, God is threaded throughout in some way or another. I found Biden's use of of this. I guess Dr. Trotskyati and I are going to disagree a little bit. I liked the actual St. Augustine quote, and then he ruined it with like a bunch of banal values that he cited afterward. And you just want to go, oh, Joe, no. If you're going to cite that lovely quotation, then, do something with it. And I have the feeling, if you look at the speech, that it was a last-minute insert. Because if you read through the speech, right before it, he says, you hear me clearly, disagreement must not lead to disunion. And then you suddenly get this whole Augustine bit. And then when he's done with that, he picks up with, and it flows much better if you just go down to this. Recent weeks and months have taught us a painful lesson. There is truth and there are lies. And every once in a while, as a critic, you realize, okay, this is where the speechwriter got overruled and the president himself probably stuck in this quote, because that paragraph just doesn't fit. And it would have flowed beautifully to go through from disagreement must not lead to disunion to recent weeks and months have taught us a painful lesson. But he's stuck in Augustine. In general, though, presidents are always going to use civil religion, and that's not an unusual aspect of the speech. And I kind of like the citation of Psalm 30, verse 5, the joy cometh in the morning. And he used the King James Version, which is much more resonant and powerful. So that was a nice move, I thought.
Thank you for that. I couldn't help but read again the speech today and see the list of problems, as you've all made mention of, the number of deaths, loss of jobs, closed businesses, crying for racial justice, the planet's concerns, and extremism and domestic terror. It seemed like it should have been a downer of a speech, and it, in some ways, is not unlike Trump's speech where he described in his inauguration the American carnage. But it certainly doesn't go that way. What about this speech gets us past that litany of awful things, or are we supposed to kind of dwell there a bit? Yeah, Brian.
It felt like when Biden was speaking, he was navigating through a war zone in the sense that the entire field was pockmarked with explosions. And there's a whole bunch of ground that's just missing. And it felt like he was going through point by point, problem by problem, and trying to refill the holes. And that's in the sense that, like, he is recognizing the disaster that just took place. If you consider President Trump's presidency and recent dealings with such crises that we've been talking about as a disaster, I think that I do. I think that it felt like he was like, oh, I recognize that hole. We can fix that easily. Let's just put this dirt in here. Let's plant a tree. It's going to be beautiful. And then he moved on. And in that sense, like, it's reflective on the pain that we just experienced, but it's also optimistic looking forward. And I think in that sense, it curbs the difficulty of talking about such crises as he had to discuss, and also makes it more of an optimistic look and hopeful look at what his presidency might continue to be.
Yeah, to extend your metaphor, Ryan, I mean, I think one of the interesting things in kind of writing up my talk was that he returns to the phrase broken land at the end. And I was sort of like, oh yeah, he's still in this battlefield, to use your language. And I think one of the purposes of this narrative that collapses space and the sacred and the American democracy story is, to use your metaphor, remind everyone that there are, these holes in the land, but the land is still there, right? And what is the quality of the land? The land has the following virtues that are still there. And if we are able to be kind of, as Dr. Murphy's talk put it, more sort of, if we can exhibit more fidelity back to our original values or our original constitution of what created this space, then we already have it within us to overcome it. I agree, Dr. Dalton. It should be kind of a bummer, and it's more American carnage was such a cheap line, and it again, we're not talking about Trump's rhetoric, but it kind of came out of nowhere, and it was sort of like, whoa, what? I remember standing up off the couch when I heard that line. This is more of a treatment of, here is our landscape. Things are bad. We have these problems, but the land is still there, right? It's just the landscape that has been altered. And I think he does a good job of, in simple ways, expressing those good qualities. He even hedges a little bit and says this may sound like a foolish fantasy, right? He's admitting that it's overly simplistic, which I think is a really interesting kind of move for him.
I fully agree with Ryan and with Dr. Worth. I mean, if he would have been disingenuous had not acknowledged the issues that we're facing. So he had to deal with those holes. And to use Ryan's metaphor, he had to deal with the war zone. I mean, we are 2 weeks out in the exact same space that an insurrection just happened, to where anything else to try to paint it as a rosy picture of, oh, we're all just going to grab hands and everything is going to be fine because now I'm president, wouldn't have been effective. And it would have also been, honestly, more damaging for the American people, to where I think he had to lay out those things. And as Dr. Worth also said, also say, here's how we heal those things. Here's how we actually deal with those issues that we are facing.
This is the part of the speech where he most clearly echoed FDR. FDR had a similar sort of litany of our problems. He wrote, values have shrunken to fantastic levels. Taxes have risen. Our ability to pay has fallen. Government of all kinds is faced by serious curtailment of income. The means of exchange are frozen in the currents of trade. The withered leaves of industrial enterprise lie on every side. Farmers find no markets for their produce. The savings of many years and thousands of families are gone. A host of unemployed citizens face the grim problem of existence. And Biden has this paragraph that says, once in a century virus silently stalks the country, taken as many lives in 1 year as America lost in all of World War II. Millions of jobs have been lost. I mean, both are expressing these kinds of problems in this generalized language that they then assure us we can overcome. Dollars to donuts, his speechwriter, had read all of the inaugurals and saw this chunk of FDR's speech.
Thank you for that. One thing crossed my mind is, and we can only, it's a counterfactual, so we can't know this, but would he have delivered this speech if Trump at the last minute had decided to come and be on the rostrum? And so we can't answer that, but what do you think is the performative value of his absence at the inauguration? Anyone?
The performative value was to speak to his followers that he's not going to accept the legitimacy of this presidency, so he wasn't going to honor it by his presence. And as far as what does that do in the long term, I don't think it does much, because I mean, we've seen the peaceful transfer of power. We've seen the president's club that he's not going to be a part of now. We're looking at, all of these former presidents who are there, and they have great relationships. They've disagreed with each other on policy and lots of things. And there's been lots of analysis about, how between H.W. Bush and Clinton, to where there was some animosity, but then they were friends. I used to work for H.W. Bush, and they actually were friends. Clinton would be in the office quite frequently, to where there is a lot to be said for that transfer. And he showed the amount of class that he actually possesses. And I think that it doesn't really take away anything from the actual transfer by him not being there. I think that it just speaks more to his followers of him standing strong about him not giving legitimacy.
Because it struck me that it helped drive home the point of the message, that this is unprecedented. His absence drives home further the message that this event is unprecedented. These moments, this time is unprecedented. Okay. The question came up very early on. If somebody'd like to field it, what is an exigence? Anyone?
Yeah, I guess that's my fault.
No, it's your fault.
So an exigence is it's something that is broken in the sort of ideology that we have in America. So for example, I was listing all of the problems that we're experiencing, like COVID and like the insurrection. These are things that Americans have never had to deal with before. So there isn't a canned response in their mind to be like, oh, I understand what we do in this situation. Instead, we're like, oh, I guess we're just going to be in a pandemic for 12 to 15 months and just deal with it. Oh, I guess the insurrection's going on today. That's interesting. And our brains can't really process what's going on because we've never seen it before. And so an exigence is sort of like, it's a moment asking for a response. It's a moment asking for someone to fix the problem in our minds, to give us a direction so that we can understand how to conceptualize the problem and then how to move forward after the problem. Another good example of like a rhetorical exigence is after 9/11 happened. After 9/11 happened, we had never seen something like that on American soil before, and everyone just had to try to conceptualize it on their own until President George W. Bush eventually walked out, gave his speech declaring a war on terror, which conceptualized the attack in everyone's minds as something familiar to Americans. War. We understood like fighting against that which just hit us. And so we were then able to conceptualize and understand better the attack that had just happened. So when I was talking about exigences and rhetorical exigences, in that sense, we had just seen an insurrection in which a bunch of people stormed the Capitol building with zip ties on their belts and were threatening to attack, kidnap, who knows? They're all under arrest now, thank goodness. But like, well, that's why I kept repeating, that's why I kept refraining, like, what do we do with that? How do we conceptualize and deal with that sort of issue? Because it is broken in our minds and it had to be put right by someone in a position of authority like Joe Biden. And I think that that's sort of what he spoke to when he spoke on the problems that we were facing, especially relating to white supremacists and the insurrection. I hope that helps.
And the exigence has to contain some aspect of urgency as well to kind of compound this need, this perceived need to remedy this brokenness. Yeah.
Thank you. Are there additional questions from our audience? Yes, Michael, you're muted. Still muted.
Okay, wow.
Here we go.
Okay, so I wonder if anyone's read Jefferson's first inaugural recently.
I have not.
And I thought a lot of what Biden did resonated what Jefferson said. Every difference of principle is not a difference of policy. We're all Republicans. We're all Democrats by different names. Then, of course, his key line, if there be any among us who would wish to overthrow this Republican form of government, let them stand undisturbed while reason is free to combat error. And that goes back to the question others have raised about the disinformation and misinformation out there, and whether a marketplace of ideas is sufficient to do that. And of course, Jefferson also championed, and I wonder if any folks might comment on this, the Latin res publica, which literally means the public thing or the public good. And I think, like Biden, the call was for people to come together to make a republic work. That was Franklin's last words at the Constitutional Convention. What do you have? A republic, res publica, if you can keep it.
I think that the example of Jefferson is an instructive one. Those are great lines that Michael quotes there, and by far the most famous lines. One of the most interesting things about Jefferson in that inaugural and that election is that the nation was only 12 years old, roughly, and we were still trying to figure out, as we are today, what it means to have a loyal opposition.
Sure.
If you've got a monarchy, to oppose a king is to commit regicide. And to oppose the government in a monarchy is to, literally oppose the whole regime. There was no such thing as a loyal opposition. You were always under threat of treason. And what the American experiment early on was trying to do was to figure out how you could have political opposition, how you could have political parties. And Jefferson was the opposition for the first several years of the country. And so that inaugural really reflects his effort to figure out a way, to articulate a way in which we can all be Americans and we can all be sort of the same name and yet also disagree. And that may be something we're going through again to try to figure out. And so Jefferson's example is instructive.
Phil, I may have a quick follow-up. That's an excellent point. As I'm sure many of you know, John Adams did not go to Jefferson's inauguration. They had been great friends along the way, but the intensity and bitterness of the conflict of the 1790s drove them apart. And then a great story is that Benjamin Rush, Philadelphia doctor and patriot, brought them together in 1812. And there's a remarkable correspondence between Jefferson and John Adams for the last 14 years of their lives. And it turned out they both died on July 4th, 1826. And when Phil raised the question about religion, a lot of people felt there may have been some larger significance in the two great founders coming together and both dying on what was the 50th anniversary of the explanation for independence. The act of independence was actually done on July 2nd, but Jefferson's document was approved on July 4th. And John Adams actually thought July 2nd would be Independence Day. But that's a different story. It's a remarkable. I just add one other point. I'm a big fan of Tom Paine. And in Common Sense, he wrote, "We have it in our power to begin the world anew. The birthday of a new world is at hand. In the old world, the king is the law. But in America, the law is king." So we take for granted the rule of law, the forming of constitutions, the flexibility of amending it. England had no written constitution. So what was formed, as you're pointing out in terms of the transition, was a republic in a world of monarchs and empires. And it was a struggle then. And good leaders, John Adams and his son, John Quincy, there's a new book about them. I can't remember the title, but it's a remarkable book. And in that book, they have a lot of criticism of Donald Trump, not by name, but they anticipate his horrific conduct that is a disgrace for any kind of political society.
Thank you for that. I have a question that came up in the chat, and it is, and I don't know how I'd answer this. Do the panelists believe that the art of social media rhetoric fractures the art of spoken rhetoric? And we could think of that from the standpoint, I guess, of an inaugural speech. I don't know where to begin with that, but does that generate anything on your part? Any thoughts?
I think that they work together now. I mean, we can't ignore the power of social media and how things get reshared, and even the inaugural address and the spoken speeches and stuff that get regenerated and reshared throughout social media. So I think that they work in conjunction with each other, but certainly being mindful of what we are reposting and what we're resharing, and whether or not it is truth that we are resharing or just something that appeals to our own idealized arguments or standpoints, and we're cherry picking things, I think is what that critical thought stuff is. And I think that that's what is so vital. The role of talking about rhetoric and talking about argumentation and talking about evidence and truth, I think is so important. And as others have said in the chat, it starts early. It should start, as early as childhood, as learning how to distinguish what's right and wrong, what's truth and false. But it continues throughout our learning process. And that's why the education, and specifically higher education, is so important, because as young people are starting to make their choices for political, becoming more politically engaged and stuff, is understanding what's actually there and how to distinguish evidence and truth, especially amongst a lot of disinformation and misinformation.
Yes, I will say, I think the fracturing of a piece of spoken rhetoric started a long time ago, not just with electronically mediated communication, before computer mediated communication, but this rhetoric was temporally fractured. Juneteenth is a great example of that, right? I mean, what was said at one time might not get to another place in the country until years later, for example. And of course, many of you may be familiar with work on presidential addresses through radio, and Neil Postman, and the sort of later rhetorical presidency work, Medhurst, and all that sort of stuff that goes through the history of mediated communication. But I might also, what the question, the use of the term fracturing really brought to mind for me was, social media is the latest kind of version of something that started quite some time ago. I remember in the 90s, all this talk about how online communication, all these online communities, which pretty much meant AOL chat rooms, were going to become these like agoras, right? These spaces of exchange of ideas and all that. And there were a few people writing at the time that, the impulse of this technology is to divide. And so the result will be division, it will be fracturing. And as if, I think it's possible in a kind of offhand way to look at our history since then. And now we see it fracturing. And in the last, couple of months, we see it fracturing in out of Facebook, into Parler. Parler's gone. Now it's into these, code protected rooms. And there are audiences not knowing where to go because their little mini agoras have sort of, evaporated. So they don't know what to do. So I think Tomeka's point's a better one than mine, that now that the entire picture is much more complicated than that. But in one sense, I would answer the question with a yes, that it is ultimately fracturing, and it will continue to do so. But I don't want to be a downer, so I'm going to go with Tomeka's answer.
Well, thank you all very much. We're out of time. We didn't lose many people, so this must have kept everyone's interest. And some questions have made me think of other events we should put together here at Hofstra. I want to say a special thanks to John Murphy for coming all the way from Illinois, and David Worth for coming all the way from Houston, Texas, and also to Ryan and Tomeka. Thank you very much for your thoughts about the inauguration, and I wish you all a good night. And have a great evening.
Thank you for the invitation. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
It was great. I really appreciate it. Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Thank you all.